grew up with the American dream.
But all Asian immigrants were denied the right of naturalized citizenship. And with the Exclusion Act, the Chinese became the first undocumented immigrants.
The American dream is a lovely dream to have, and so people continue to aspire, enduring whatever it is that they've got to do as immigrants.
Japanese Americans fought on the side of the United States while the rest of their family was incarcerated.
Legal challenges were so important because they did not have political power.
And as much as tragedy is a part of our heritage here, so is possibility.
Asian voices are coming out.
You've got these young people fighting to make change happen.
They had to assert their rights. It was like a genie coming out of the bottle. You couldn't put us back in.
These are stories about what it meant to be human, what it meant to be resilient.
To transform the system into something more just for everyone. That's the hope from which the Asian American movement was born.
Major funding for Asian Americans was provided by the Wallace H. Coulter Foundation, Just Films, Ford Foundation, National Endowment for the Humanities, Exploring the Human Endeavor, the Arthur Vining Davis Foundations, Investing in Our Common Future, the Freeman Foundation, Carnegie Corporation of New York, K Family Foundation, Long Family Foundation, Spring Wang, and California Humanities. This program is made possible by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and from contributions to this PBS station from viewers like you. Thank you.
One, two, three. Testing, testing. 1, 2, 3.
In the 1960s, Asian Americans are looking at the world through a new lens. Everything is in upheaval, and anything is possible. As the children of immigrants, Asians are trying to understand their role in America's history. They are claiming their voice in the fields, on college campuses, and in the public square. No one can imagine where these struggles will take them. California's Central Valley, one of the richest agricultural regions of the United States and home to some of its poorest workers. It is here where Asian Americans spark a farm labor movement that will galvanize the world. For Alex Fabros, the story begins with World War II, when his family emigrates from the Philippines. Like many new arrivals, they rely on farm work to make ends meet.
The family came to California in 1948. So my father's in the military, but on the weekends, my dad would work out in the fields just to earn extra money so he could buy a house in Salinas. And in 1950, he buys a home in a part of Salinas where Asians are not allowed to own homes. And they tell him, "We don't want you in this neighborhood." After we moved in, they would take stones and they'd break our windows. My mother had brand new rose bushes. And they would come in, they'd tie ropes around the rose bushes and they'd do wheelies on the lawn. There's this kid that had this dog, and he'd sick that dog on me. I'm about 6 years old and I'm running as fast as I can. This dog is barking at my heels. It's a German Shepherd. So my father went around the neighborhood He had a pistol, and he banged the doors and said, "The fight's between you and me and not my family." And nobody bothered us after my father did that. Years later, I enrolled in a local junior college, but I basically flunked out. My father said, "You're going to go work on your grandfather's farm until you decide exactly what it is you want to do. You've got to learn what life really is like on the outside." So I became a migrant farm worker in Delano, California.
Alex joins the army of farm laborers that crisscross California harvesting crops. Working long hours for low wages, they're not protected by labor laws and can be fired at any time.
You get up at 4 o'clock in the morning. You're hoeing, you're bent over. It's cold, it's wet out there. But these guys are working hard for $1.25 an hour. These are really old Filipino men. We call them the manongs. Manongs is a term of respect that we give to people who are older than us. In the evenings, these old men would sit outside and they'd tell stories about what it was like to grow up in California in the 1930s. And they'd say, "Junior, go back to school, become something, become someone. You know, don't end up like us."
Very few Filipino women were able to immigrate to the U.S., and Filipino men were barred from marrying white women. As a result, an entire generation is forced to live out their lives as bachelors deprived of family. But there are some exceptions.
I'm half Filipino and half Mexican. My father met my mother working in the fields, and he didn't speak Spanish and she didn't speak English, and so my father learned how to speak Spanish so that he could get to know her. If my father not met my mother, he would have been like the Manongs. I was born in a labor camp a mile and a half from Delano. It was a 2-bedroom barrack bunkhouse. We all slept together. There were 7 of us, and then my mom and dad. The bathroom was out back, which was shared with 2 other families. So you got to know your neighbors well. Working in the fields, you work in the fields from when you're a child. There were no labor laws that prevent parents bringing their children to work. It gives them one less thing to worry about if your children are out there working with you.
A lot of Filipino men wanted me to become the person they could not become. They're telling me, "We'll save money for you to go to college." A lot of these old men had that dream of having us young kids out of the field, not to go through what they did for the last 20, 30 years.
By the mid-1960s, working conditions have gone from bad to worse. The Manongs reach a tipping point. They're willing to put their jobs and lives on the line to establish a union.
We want to have medical benefits. When one of our guys falls down and he gets hurt, someone's got to cover his benefits. We're going to have a health plan. When these guys get old, we're going to have a pension plan.
Larry Itliong was president of the Agricultural Workers Organizing Committee, known as AWOC. Summer of '65, he began to talk about organizing, improving the working conditions, increasing the salaries.
We feel that we farm workers should have an organization of our own.
One of the things that most people forget is that it was the Filipinos in September 1965 who started the grape strike, not the Mexicans.
The strike happened mainly because of Larry Itliong's will and determination. He was a trained labor leader. He was gruff. He was not a polished speaker.
I was 13 years old the day that my family went out on strike. I remember we were working when my father says, "Come on, we're leaving." I says, "We're leaving, it's 10 o'clock in the morning." So we left.
To go on strike, you suffer a lot of hardship. Maybe you get hungry, maybe you're gonna lose your car, maybe you're gonna lose your house.
And I remember leaving the field and driving through seeing the strikers, the Filipinos.
But the Filipinos face a dilemma. As they strike for a union, the farmers bring in Mexican workers to replace them.
It's one of the things I learned that farmers like to do. They like to pit the Mexicans against the Filipinos because you're going to be fighting for the same pot of gold.
Many Mexican laborers have already joined the National Farm Workers Association, led by the charismatic Cesar Chavez.
I remember meeting at the Filipino Community Hall in Delano. And all the labor contractors were there, and a lot of the farm workers were there, and they're trying to decide, are we going to end the strike? Or are we going to negotiate with the Mexicans to join us? And then Larry Leong, he gets up and says, "I'm going to go talk to the Mexicans."
When the strike happened, Cesar Chavez wasn't really quite ready. But Cesar also knew that if they didn't join the Filipinos then they would never happen.
Larry approaches Cesar Chavez and his colleague Dolores Huerta, another powerful organizer.
Come on up, brothers, we are waiting for you!
As one of AWOC's co-founders, her relationship with Larry and the Filipinos goes back years.
And then a couple days later, we're at this church. They're talking about the strike. They're discussing, should we go on strike or not go on strike? And all of a sudden there's this swelga. I said, "What the heck, swelga?" Because I thought they were saying, "Hell no." I said, "No, it means strike, we're going on strike." And so the Mexicans joined us.
Where are your brothers and sisters over here? Come on! Come on now! ¡Viva la causa! ¡Viva!
They take the Mexican labor movement and the Filipino labor movement, they create the United Farm Workers.
And they really pushed that the workers eat together, they have meetings together, that they were on picket lines together. And it was only because of they become one union that they were able to win the strike.
Larry knew that his style was not good PR. He was aggressive. He wore his emotions on his sleeve. He needed Cesar's charisma, his ability to speak. Cesar was the spokesman.
It's going to be built by farm workers, and it's going to be for farm workers.
Whereas Larry wanted to get down and dirty. He wanted to work out in the fields.
Delano became more than a farm labor dispute. It became, in a sense, the West Coast civil rights movement for people of color. All of a sudden, people started equating what was happening in Delano to the Black Civil Rights Movement on the East Coast in Alabama and Mississippi. You started having these politicians coming out there. You have Robert Kennedy holding hearings as to why the white growers are not going to give people of color these benefits that they're asking for. Not only are you boycotting in Delano, now you're sending groups and college students and people who believe in a labor union and equal rights to do a secondary grape strike. And now they're boycotting in New York, they're boycotting in Montreal in Canada, they're boycotting in Europe, they're boycotting California grapes.
The strike and boycott against grapes will continue.
It took 5 years to finally get the growers to sign a contract. And that was only because people went out on the boycott and they convinced people all over the United States not to eat grapes. Growers couldn't sell their products, and so they had to sign.
Larry Leong, what do you have to say about seeing grapes at the stores after all this time?
Well, I think that it's great, and thanks to the co-op stores that have been supporting the grape boycott to help bring about justice and dignity on behalf of the farm workers.
For me, that's one of my pride and joys. Yeah, Filipinos were here and we made a difference.
Working in the fields. That's where I realized that if a lot of people put their mind to it, they can win. I left field working behind me completely. But I never left the memories of these guys. My decision to leave was made for me not because I wanted to leave, but because I had received my draft notice.
Alex Fabros ships out for Vietnam, one of thousands of Asian Americans who will serve in the most polarizing and disruptive global event of the 1960s.
In South Vietnam, the seemingly endless war against the communists is once again in the forefront of world attention.
As of today, there are 507,000 American troops in Vietnam.
I had a lot of nightmares about Vietnam that I don't want to talk about.
This is the fourth war the United States has fought in Asia in only 60 years. As in Korea, the country's perceived enemy is communism. Many Asian Americans are forced to confront their racial identity in a whole new light.
I was pretty wild in high school. I used to get in a lot of trouble. I decided, you know, I need to get out of LA, so I joined the Marine Corps. The idea of Vietnam didn't even cross my mind. I was 18. At that age, I didn't think past a week in front of me. As soon as I got to boot camp, the drill instructors told us, well, you know, all you guys in this platoon are probably going to end up in Vietnam, 95% of you. And half of you aren't going to make it back.
When I decided to enlist, it was not a deeply thought out decision. When I went to boot camp, we had to line up on these yellow footprints in single file, and they instructed us to go tallest to shortest. 4 drill instructors pulled out the 2 biggest guys in the front, and they beat them down, kicked them. They were bleeding. I was thinking, what have I done? I mean, this is like a big mistake. During one of these classes, my drill instructor says, Private Nakayama, stand up. I stood up at attention. He goes, turn around. So I turned around, and he goes, all right, everybody, this is what a gook looks like. You remember this, because they're going to come after you.
I arrived in Vietnam in October of 1967. I was stationed at Quezon and Hill 881 during the Tet Offensive of 1968. It was the biggest battle of the war.
The pressure at Quezon has lasted a week now, a bad week for the Marines here, a week in which they've suffered under the guns of the North Vietnamese in these surrounding hills.
The hill I was on, 881, we had a 100% casualty rate. That means out of the 400 Marines initially stationed on the hill, 400 Marines were either killed or wounded in the 3 months I was there. Not a fun place to be.
We would go out for 30 to 60 days into the jungle. We're trying to draw out the North Vietnamese army into battles. I was 11 months there, and we had set up a perimeter next to a hill. Boom, we got hit with rockets. And then I got hit from a grenade explosion in my shoulder. And I'm thinking I'm gonna die here. I got taken off the helicopter in the stretcher. The treatment tables are in the back, and there are doctors, and they're treating people. They treated him, and they left me. And I was the last one. I said, hey, man, when you guys gonna treat me? And he says, oh, you should have told us you were American. We thought you were the gook.
Asian American women also serve in Vietnam. Lily Adams is Chinese-Italian from the Bronx. When she tells her father she's enlisted in the Army, it's the first time she sees him cry.
I was in nursing school. An Army nurse recruiter come to visit our school once, and she made it sound pretty good because it would pay for my last year of nursing school. I would have some money in my pocket. I got orders for Vietnam. I was 20. It was the town of Cu Chi, and we had built a giant military base. We were told it was the busiest hospital in Vietnam. My first day, this guy said, well, I'm Dr. So-and-so, and we could like kind of pair up and spend some 12 months together. And I basically worked to contain my anger. And I said, thank you very much. It's very nice of you, but I'm not interested. That was my first day. I was mistaken for a Vietnamese prostitute. If I wanted to walk around the compound, I had to be in uniform. And even when I was in uniform, sometimes these guys would ask me if I wanted to do whatever for so much money. I was afraid of American GIs because they really believed that we were there for them. I had to be vigilant, very vigilant, on base, off base, or whatever.
When I was there, the Vietnamese people would come up and try to trade for stuff, you know, for cigarettes and sea rations. You know, some of the Vietnamese people looked at me and said, hey, you same Vietnam. And for a minute, I thought, what are they talking about? Then I got it. You know, hey, you look like me, and you're just like us. We called them gooks. That's what I thought they were. And then when he said that to me, then I thought, well, wait a minute, I must be a gook also.
I'm 22 years old. I'm a sergeant. I was assigned to a unit in Vietnam that required translators. One day, Sergeant C calls me up and says, Al, they think they've got a VC that they just captured in the village. Well, we went out there, and the Vietnamese security people had already worked him over a little bit. And I squatted down next to him so that we're eye to eye. And I asked him in Vietnamese, why are you fighting us? He looks right at me, right in my eyes. Why are you here? This is my country. Why are you here? I think right at that moment, I realized that, okay, Alex, why are you here?
1968 is a transformative year in American history, and specifically for Asian Americans. Many of us were deeply affected by gruesome images of death and destruction. At the same time, there was upheaval in America. Cities were exploding. Dr. Martin Luther King would be assassinated. There were other killings, political murders. It felt like the world was about to explode.
The younger generations started taking positions very strong on what was happening in Vietnam. And it was because we had so many returning Vietnam veterans who were telling us the truth about what was going on.
The war in Vietnam, the problems of race and the cities, these are issues facing the citizens of the United States. And they are issues vividly facing the students on an urban campus.
As the school year begins, Students are trying to make sense of a world turned upside down. At San Francisco State, a college with a mostly white student body, young people of color question whether their own education is failing them. They demand more minority faculty and a curriculum that reflects their lives and concerns, and they want it now. Students like Dan Gonzalez, Penny Nakatsu, and Lorene Chu, all of them 18 or 19 years old.
I grew up in San Francisco's Chinatown. Growing up in Chinatown was a very nurturing experience. You had a community that you interacted with on a daily basis, especially for my mom, who didn't speak English. I was accepted into San Francisco State in 1966, and that's only because my mom refused to have me go away for college. She thought the worst. Like, I would be some wayward woman having free sex everywhere or something like that.
Galvanized by the civil rights movement and the death of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., student activists organized to have more classes in Black history and culture.
We're trying to start a Black Studies program at State College, and I think that it has the greatest and last hope to solve the educational problems of the Black race.
The demand for Black studies was influencing Asian Americans. We started reflecting on our own experiences and saying, yeah, you know, we need to have something like that for ourselves.
For your information, Philippine refers to the country and Filipino refers to the people. This is exactly what we want, a study of Filipino culture and history.
I was trying to figure out who I was. And then I met this other Chinese girl who grew up in South City, and she was much more adventurous. And she was the one that asked me to go to this meeting.
Lorene joins the impromptu gatherings that are springing up all over campus. Black and brown students call for solidarity with the people of colonized Latin America, Asia, and Africa, what they call the Third World.
This is the first time in the history of all existing colleges in the United States that we have dissolved class barriers between people of the Third World.
It was a real aha for me, saying like, wow, you know, they're not Chinese, but we have similar experiences in terms of the dominant culture not validating who we are.
African Americans have been here for a long time. They were well established. Their civil rights movement was complemented by our perspective, for example, on internment and the concentration camp experience of Japanese Americans, on the exclusion of Asians from citizenship, decades-long, almost a century-long exclusion by design.
In 1968, Alex Fabros is serving in the Marines, but he has friends in college who are confronting these issues.
Our story that's not taught in the classrooms. The Chinese built the railroads. Okay, that's it. They didn't talk about the hardship. They didn't talk about the exploitation. The laws that they passed against the Chinese. They didn't talk about the Filipinos working in the fields. They didn't talk about the farm labor strikes. Total omission.
That is what the Third World Liberation Front was about. To tell the true histories of the people who contributed and built this country.
History, I never learned anything about the history of Asian Americans or Japanese Americans or camps. That eventually led me to involve myself in political activism. What we wanted to see was an educational institution that served the communities, served the people.
Under the umbrella of the Third World Liberation Front, Asian, Latino, and Native American students, as well as progressive whites, join forces with the Black Student Union.
One of the major objectives was to start a school of ethnic studies. We called it Third World Studies, that would have the same status as other established schools on the campus.
At first, the administration seems open to a school of ethnic studies. But students grow frustrated with what they see as empty promises. After months of inaction by the university, the students call for a general strike on November 6, 1968.
The BSU TWLF demands ask that a school of third world studies be formed that was based on the concept of self-determination. We asked for students and faculty members to boycott, stop classes, stop business as usual.
Our main thing on campus was to be disruptive, to force the administration to be responsive to the demands.
Lorene and others use a variety of tactics to make their point. They interrupt classes, form picket lines, and broadcast their demands by loudspeaker. Their goal, to shut the school down.
I was with one group where people picked up the typewriters and threw it across the room, and students got all freaked out and started running out of the classroom, you know, because we were that passionate to start a school of ethnic studies.
But behind the scenes, students like Dan Gonzalez are doing the hard work of building a brand new curriculum from scratch.
That was my major task, understanding how to put courses together. Filipino Americans, Chinese Americans, Japanese Americans drafted their own curriculum proposals. And then we all met together as Asian Americans and talked about how we were going to start these courses.
In those days, the term Asian American didn't exist. We were all Orientals. 1968, that was the first time that I heard the term Asian Americans.
There's a strike going on here, and that means that either you're on our side or you're against us.
No one anticipates the magnitude of the strike. From the start, the police come in force to shut down the protesters.
A little dissident group with their 15 non-negotiable demands. You talk about negotiating. I would call to your attention that the Black Student Union has declared that their demands are non-negotiable.
Soon afterward, the state of California appoints a new president, S.I. Hayakawa, an English professor at the college.
And he was supposed to shut us down.
It was really clear to us that he was being used because he was a person of color. And if he could exercise his authority and power in a manner that was consistent with the Ronald Reagan way of dealing with campus upheaval, he was going to be very useful.
The new president, renowned as an expert in the meaning of language, decided early in the day to face his critics. The communication failure was obvious. Hayakawa took that matter and the sound truck wiring into his own hands.
Some of the militants have called you an Uncle Tom. They say they thought that you would identify with the minority groups, such as the blacks.
Yes.
What is your answer to them?
Well, I'm the first Japanese Uncle Tom in history. I think it's kind of an achievement.
He forbade any rallies on campus. That he threatened, you know, you have a rally, I'm going to arrest all of you. And that was kind of like a turning point. The rally was going to be called at 12 noon. I heard all these people outside already saying that on strike, shut it down.
It all happened really quickly. I saw the police come running up with their batons in hand.
Go to your classes. Disperse from the center of the campus.
Suddenly, there was like a military movement. A tax squad on horses. They came out from the gym and just like surrounded all of us. But then it just got all quiet. And then at that point, no one could get out. The tax squad just surrounded us. We could not leave. If you were in that circle, you were going to be arrested.
There was over 1,000 police, dogs, horses, paddy wagon, who will fight the oppressor on our terms, not theirs.
This morning, they're going to arraign 10 at a time all of those who were arrested out at San Francisco State College.
I was not going to cop a plea. I mean, my mother had a hissy fit. What are you doing, getting arrested? I have one child whom I thought I raised and spent money, go to a high-end Catholic school. You should be like a saint.
Lorene and a few other demonstrators argue their case in court, but a jury sentences her to 20 days in prison.
When I finally had to go to jail, she was devastated. She came and visited me in jail. I was so scared of being there. When I saw her, I just started to cry. And then she did also, basically knowing that I shouldn't be there. After I finished my 20 days, for the first time I heard her say something to defend me. She said, my daughter was not very smart, but I'll say this, she did not hurt anybody. And what she wanted to do was to make a better world for people.
The San Francisco State Strike is the longest student strike in U.S. history. After 5 months, the administration finally agrees to establish a school of ethnic studies. The legacy of the strike defines a generation eager to change society and asserts a new identity as Asian Americans.
It's just like the Filipinos and the Mexicans getting together to form a labor union. Asian American encompasses everybody. I thought, wow, that's something. People are finally starting to realize that we wear our race on our face.
The Asian American movement bursts forth across the country. In New Jersey, Gordon Chang is one of only 5 Asian students in his class at Princeton.
It was the summer of 1969 when I came back to the Bay Area and met a lot of the activists who had been at San Francisco State, who were at UC Berkeley. It was a stunning moment for those of us. So we look at each other and all of a sudden found that we had so much in common. If we were to transform society, we had to move beyond the ivory tower gates and to go into where everyday people lived.
When we moved to New York, we were told, there's a budding Asian American movement. You've got to really get involved in that.
You have to remember that there was not an Asian American sense before, and it was just starting to gel. The first things we got involved with were these demonstrations.
I remember my mother. I told her about going to anti-war demonstrations and sharing with her my hope for a radical new world. And she was very upset. She was almost crying. And she said, this is their country. They're just going to shoot you down. And I said, well, this is my country. This is where I live, and this is what I feel I must do.
It felt great to be part of this groundswell of a movement that was just enveloping the country. We were involved with Black, Asian, white Latinos, and that was incredible. And then there's this duo, Chris and Joanne, and they're singers, folk singers. They sing about the Asian American experience.
These are 2 young people that they call themselves Yellow Pearl. Their grandparents were Japanese, I guess, and they're young singers called Chris and Joanna, and beautiful singers, and they have a story to tell. They're going to come on now and do it. Here they are, Yellow Pearl.
Usually, people know very little about Asians, and this is a song about our movement, about our people's plight in America. We are the children of the migrant worker. We are the offspring of the concentration camp, sons and daughters of the railroad builder who leave their stamp on America.
It was a very powerful thing to be able to do that for Asian Americans, for young people to hear us sing these words, because We had never had our own song.
Sing a song for ourselves. What have we got to lose? Sing a song for ourselves.
And there's something about music that is a visceral thing. It's emotional. You can't do it in a speech. You can't do it by reading a book. It was like a genie coming out of the bottle. You couldn't put us back in. You can't just have a leaflet. You can't just have a demonstration. The art gives flesh and blood to the politics. People were drawing. People were making posters. People were making films. People were writing. People were doing poetry.
I told you so, oh yes. You take your old name back, Chano. I told you so, oh yes, Chano.
I really appreciate the visual arts, the poster art, but also the documentary filmmaking that I think is so important in helping craft an Asian American identity.
Even as Asian American culture is blossoming, the war in Vietnam continues to rage. Veterans returning home have to grapple with their role in the conflict.
Coming home is the biggest cultural shock, especially during the 60s. You kind of went from Leave It to Beaver when I left to the hippies and the radical anti-war movement when you get back. I started going to LA City College. Since I was a Vietnam veteran and there weren't too many around, that subject came up a lot. Hey, you were in Vietnam, you know, you're Asian American, you're a Marine Corps veteran. What did you think about the war?
Before and during, I didn't have a concept of the racist nature of the war. Afterwards, I was very aware. It was such a traumatic and extreme experience. I wanted to be able to understand what happened. So that drove me into looking into the anti-war movement.
Bring home. Bring our brothers home.
The Winter Soldier investigation was put on by the Vietnam Veterans Against the War. They were trying to get the opinion of the veterans, the people who actually fought in the war.
It was a Holiday Inn with a large auditorium. And there was tables set up in the front with about 15 chairs, and then there was the audience. So different groups of vets would go up and would talk about what atrocities they experienced or participated in. We were all the non-whites, and they never asked us to participate. And so when it was almost over, we just went up and took over the tables and chairs and just started talking.
We all spoke and gave the perspective from each individual.
How do these atrocities get to be committed? They just don't happen. There's a whole thing of how they tell you, that the people over there aren't really people, but they can't deny the testimony of all these dudes in the room.
We today have concluded an agreement to end the war and bring peace with honor in Vietnam.
Saigon, April the 30th, 8 o'clock. The last American helicopter on the roof of the American embassy prepares to lift off the last of the evacuees fleeing before the advancing communist armies.
Tens of thousands of Vietnamese still struggle to escape their homeland for a new life elsewhere.
They are always arriving, these so-called boat people, sometimes as many as 1,000 in one day.
The war in Vietnam is officially over, but its effects resonate for years to come. A new generation of refugees from Southeast Asia will soon enrich the American experience.
Typically, when it comes to war, we believe that it is the victors who write the history. The Americans, for the most part, have gotten to write the history of this war, whether it's in books or whether it's in movies. Americans can't completely rewrite the past to say they won the war, but they put themselves at the center of the story. So even if it's a tragedy in which they lose, they're the stars of the tragedy. Despite the fact that the overwhelming majority of people who died were Southeast Asians. I really don't remember much about Vietnam. My memory really begins coming here to the United States as a refugee arriving in Fort Indian Town Gap in Pennsylvania. My parents found an opportunity. They opened a Vietnamese grocery store in downtown San Jose on East Santa Clara Street, which is the heart of the city. My impression of San Jose is inseparable from the experiences of being a refugee. These refugees were suffering. You know, they were trying to build a life for themselves here, and yet they were still traumatized by the war, or they were trying to forget the war. I remember when I was around 10 or 11 years old, walking down the street from my parents' store and seeing a sign in another store window that said, "Another American driven out of business by the Vietnamese." And I knew that this was directed at people like my parents. My parents worked 12 to 14-hour days in this store almost every day of the year. My parents were shot in that store on Christmas Eve. And so, for me, that sign will stay with me because it was a sign that was a story that was targeted at my parents and everybody like us. And so I swore one day that I would have an opportunity to rewrite that sign, to write another story.
I was born in 1974. I was born in District 5, which is called Jalung, which is like Chinatown in Vietnam. And then my aunt, who had left in 78, sponsored our family. So we left in 83. Grew up in Southern California, in Santa Ana. I had no awareness that the war had just happened. Probably because my parents protected us from all of that. And my dad, though he had gone to re-education camps, we didn't know much about that. We didn't really talk much about that. The only education I ever got from the Vietnam War was Apocalypse Now, Deer Hunter, Platoon.
Hollywood made literally dozens of movies about the war in Vietnam through the 70s and the 80s. And they posed a real problem for me because I was a war fanatic. I really enjoyed war, was into soldiers and guns, and identifying with American soldiers. And the problem was that they were fighting Vietnamese people. So to see movies like Apocalypse Now when I was 10 or 11, and to watch Vietnamese people being slaughtered, massacred, or raped in the case of other films was really traumatic for me. Coming to Berkeley as a student in the late 1980s was really a transformative moment for me.
I remember when I was being arrested and cuffed, and I was looking at the floor, and I was thinking, God, this is what Berkeley's all about.
The first class I took there was Ronald Takaki's Intro to Asian American Studies. He had just published his book, Strangers from a Different Shore, which was the first major collective history of Asian Americans. Most of us in this classroom had never heard so many of the things that he was lecturing about. They were Asian American students back then. Now they'd become the Asian American Studies professors. And I remember them, telling us, well, the 60s are going to happen again any moment now. That was the 1990s. We were convinced that was going to happen. They had committed their lives to academic knowledge, but also this idea of the necessity of Asian American studies as an activist practice. And their classes were absolutely fundamental to me in terms of turning me into a scholar, but also into an Asian American.
Ham Tran is also seeking to address the unspoken trauma experienced by Vietnamese Americans. He raises $1.5 million from his community to make a film about the war from a Vietnamese point of view.
Making Journey from the Fall, we had an opportunity to tell this people's story, the people who was involved. When we were casting, I didn't want to cast actors, so I was looking for real people who had had experience within the community. We saw like 600-something people. People would come and then share their stories with us.
Thì cái anh đó, anh ta đứng dậy, tay còn cầm cối thuốc lào, anh giơ tay lên đầu hàng. Thì anh cán bộ nó bắn giữa ngực anh một phát. Và anh ngã xuống chết, tay vẫn còn cầm cối thuốc lào.
My education was my audition process. A lot of people telling me stories. Hearing 500 stories within 2 weeks really just... Some people, I felt like they've been waiting years to get this off their chest. The woman who came to visit the re-education camp to give the news to our main character, she shared with us the day that she went to visit him and how she slid her foot under the table and spoke with him. And the only way they had contact was through that, right? It was such a beautiful moment. I'm like, let's try to capture that on film.
And action.
Journey from the Fall is embraced by the Vietnamese American community and considered a critical success. Meanwhile, Viet Thanh Nguyen is seeking a way to address the legacy of the war.
I wanted to confront what had been done to us. I wanted to be a writer, I wanted to be an activist, I wanted to be a scholar, and I didn't want to give up any of those kinds of things.
Tonight, our guest is the author, Viet Thanh Nguyen.
I wanted to write a novel that, evoked the fall of Saigon and the Vietnam War, and to tell it from a perspective that we hadn't seen before.
In 2015, Viet is awarded the Pulitzer Prize for The Sympathizer, a darkly comedic tale about an undercover communist agent whose loyalties are split between Vietnam and the United States.
Viet Thanh Nguyen, everybody.
All this success was made possible by pioneering people.
You've got these young people, all under probably age 21, fighting to make change happen. And they had dreams. A lot of those people went on to become professionals. Some became judges, some became lawyers, a few became professors.
Former student activists Dan Gonzalez and Lorene Chu become professors of Asian American Studies at San Francisco State. After retiring from the military, Alex Fabros would also study and teach Asian American history there. 50 years after the Third World Strike, there are now dozens of ethnic studies programs across the country, and Asian American studies courses are taking root in unexpected places. Today, volunteers teach a weekly course to inmates at San Quentin State Prison. Students learn about Asian American history, from exclusion to civil rights to the war in Southeast Asia. The program's motto, if you know history, you know yourself. On graduation day, students are recognized for their achievements and celebrate their gains.
I give to you the graduating class of Root Supercycle 5 Cap 35. Another person we want to celebrate today, a person that we affectionately know as one of our Blackanese students. And I'm gonna bring Thanh Tran up to the stage here.
this entire Roots experience, it's been nothing but love, inclusivity, and feeling like I finally have a family, feeling like there's support out there. And that's tremendous. My mother, she's Vietnamese and Black. But the problem is that I never got to know my mother, because when I was 2 years old, I was placed into foster care, and I lost more than just my mom. I lost my roots. I lost my only connection to my roots in America, because I had no other family here besides her. I began to notice that it was more than just the Asian struggle, the Latinx and Black struggle. These were stories about what it meant to be human. And that's what Roots taught me. So I want to thank that team for seeing the humanity in me, for seeing the humanity in our brothers, for bringing Roots to us, dedicating your free time to us. Because for a lot of us, we didn't have a family, we didn't have hope, and you give us that.
In 1968, when Asian Americans came into being, now that story is no longer new. There should be a new story beyond that. But I'm committed to the new story. A new generation will go off and do something that I might find offensive, or I might disagree with, or that I may just not understand. That's fantastic. That's a logical consequence of what we wanted to do as a part of an Asian American movement, to create a situation in which Asian Americans were free to do anything they wanted.